Hello and a very warm welcome to Dorset Humanists, especially if you're coming here for the first time or you're a visitor. In the unlikely event of an emergency, we can go out that way, follow the green signs, either that way or that way, out into the open and the pouring rain, which will douse the flames. So please take this opportunity to turn off your mobile phone. I will do that as well. I've just become aware that when I turn the sound down to nothing, that doesn't stop certain notifications coming through, so I'm going to turn it right off. If I can manage that. And there's always someone who forgets and you get chirping in the middle.
Yeah.
So they'll get pointed at.
There we go.
Okay, we aim to wrap up by 9:15, but please stay and chat in the bar. We'll be here or in the bar. Now, we're recording the debate, and there's a camera in the middle of the room, and I was going to say, if you're near the camera, that's also the sound recording device, so it's good to make your asides very quiet, or they may appear on YouTube, and you may not want that. Right. The motion for the debate is not on the screen. Personal sacrifice will be required by everyone to ensure that the world achieves carbon net zero by 2050. Now, it was suggested that I give an introduction of the facts and the science of climate change and global warming. I'm not sure how an explanation of the discussion of the science of climate change would take less than about the whole evening. And we have done it before, if you remember. How long ago was that? We've had a number of talks on climate science.
2 years ago we...
A couple of... Yeah, okay. So let's not do that. I printed off, in preparation for this introduction, the IPCC press release, not their whole report, from August this year. So I might just read a couple of paragraphs from that. Scientists are observing changes in the Earth's climate in every region and across the whole climate system. Many of the changes observed in the climate are unprecedented in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And some of the changes already set in motion, such as continued sea level rise, are irreversible over hundreds to thousands of years. However, strong and sustained reductions in emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases would limit climate change. And the co-chair of the IPCC, who is Valérie Masson-Delmotte, said, "This report is a reality check. We now have a much clearer picture of the past, present and future climate, which is essential for understanding where we are headed, what can be done and how we can prepare." Now, you're aware that there are UN summit meetings, roughly annually, on climate change, called the Conference of the Parties, COP, and they're the Conference of the Parties to the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In 2015, there was the COP21, roughly 21 years after the 1992, they've missed out a few years, and that resulted in the Paris Agreement, and that committed countries to act to keep the Earth's average surface temperature increase to well below 2 degrees centigrade relative to the pre-industrial era, and to aim for 1.5 degrees centigrade. So, according to a reference I've got here, the world's remaining CO2 budget to achieve that is around 350 billion tonnes to stay within that limit, but we're currently using up more than 10% of that per year. I can give you the reference for that. It's Breaking Boundaries, The Science of Our Planet by Rockstrom and Gaffney, 2021 document. Ah, yeah, that's it. Good. Yes, thanks. In short, we need to flatten the curve of CO2 emissions, and there needs to be a decisive shift in the current decade if we're to get to net zero by 2050. So COP26 is happening this year. The UN say this is the latest round of annual global climate talks and will take place end of October to middle of November in Glasgow. Thousands of government delegates and people from civil society, business and the media will gather to advance climate action. The world will be watching and demanding that national leaders rise to the moment given the mounting climate crisis. And they say the three top priorities are keep the global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius through rapid, bold emissions cuts and net zero commitments. Increase international finance for adaptation to change to at least half of the total spent on climate action. And meet the existing commitment to provide $100 billion in international climate finance each year so that developing countries can invest in green technologies and protect lives and livelihoods against worsening climate impacts. In the UK, a couple of years ago, May 2019, the UK Parliament declared a climate emergency, acquiescing to one of the demands of Extinction Rebellion. A month later, Parliament agreed to legislate for the ambitious target of reaching net zero by 2050, and the UK was the first economy to do so. How can this be achieved? Two schools of thought appear to be emerging. One is that everyone will have to make deep and painful sacrifices to reduce their personal carbon footprints, and the other is that personal sacrifice is futile. What we need is a kind of Earthshot mission to rapidly transition the global economy to climate-friendly technologies. And you remember, not long ago we had a talk about eco-modernism and some of the concepts of that from Sophie Robinson. Now, that's only taken 5 minutes, so I'm just going to show a couple of slides with Simon's help. So go do the next one. Yeah.
That's interesting. Why is that not coming?
Why is that not coming
Do
in?
you want to use the
Or not, possibly.
Or not?
It's meant to be a little bit of factual input just before we get going.
Right, the keyboard usually advances the slide.
The keyboard.
Yeah, on the keyboard, the right arrow might advance the slide.
Could a resident IT expert come and help?
Well, no. Let's just not do it now. I might come back to those later on.
Yeah.
Okay, I might come back to those later on. Right, I'm going to introduce the speakers. Simon is a member of Dorset Humanist Committee, and he's one of our events organisers. Simon will speak in favour of the motion. David is the chairman of Dorset Humanists, and he will speak against the motion. So that's why you've got a stand-in chair for the event. I think I was asked partly because I'm supposed to be impartial, and I think I do have reservations and uncertainties about both of the stances we're going to hear about, uncertainties anyway. But I don't have about the IPCC science, taking into account that they acknowledge the uncertainties that they have in their numbers. So I'm here to learn. So the purpose of this evening's debate is to talk about the approach to the problem. What's the best way of achieving net zero? Not to debate whether there is a problem. I might remind you of that when it comes to the Q&A. Because I don't think any of us up here anyway, want to spend the evening talking about whether climate change is actually happening. I've got some points by members who couldn't be here to inject into the Q&A later. But what I will do is start with Simon. I'll give him the timer, which is on this thing. And just for Simon and David's benefit, the timer is 15 minutes, and when it goes off there will be a quiet chirping sound which will hopefully irritate them enough to stop speaking. But we'll see what happens. Okay, Simon?
I'm just, oh, that isn't what. Sorry, we're just having some IT issues. It
Okay,
was
so
working
you
when
want to
we
get your
rehearsed it
slides.
beforehand.
Have you got that?
Ah, that, whatever that does.
Okay. Okay. Now you've got your.
You click on next slide too.
Yeah. Now do you want?
Let's just rehearse it. Yeah, that's fine.
working.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to take your seat.
Right, okay.
Starting timer.
I was very much hoping that Phil would forget to click the timer, but he's too efficient as a chairman for that. If I overrun, well, so be it. I've got a lot to say, and there's an awful lot to work out. It's perhaps worth just adding one thing about the Glasgow conference, that we have 191 countries and counting, none of whom are required to do anything. They're all required to submit their nationally determined contributions, and they can decide whatever they want. They have to report every 5 years how they're getting on, but that's about it. I think the fundamental issue about this debate is about honesty. I'm not saying that David and I are, one or other of us is dishonest, but the sort of reactions that everybody has when there is some really bad news that the world's cooking and that we've got a challenge which is to stop the world boiling over, people respond in certain almost predictable ways. And this is the first way they respond. And this was only a month ago. That gentleman, who's apparently a very nice chap, the leader of New Forest District Council, and he's a scientist, but he is still a climate change denier. So good luck if you live in the New Forest. They won't be having any climate mitigation plan. But yes, as Phil has said, we're not going to try and deal with climate change deniers. It's just one of the many types of ways that people shirk the bad news. And of course, this is an example of how our national press shirks the bad news and throws a lot of sand in the air so that no one's quite sure. Can everybody see that who wants to? Good, good. Essentially, the Daily Mail is saying, yeah, well, there's probably there probably is global warming, but what Britain does is insignificant, and anyway, probably what we're doing is counterproductive. It doesn't really help just to blame others for getting it wrong. And then, of course, that's one actually very sensible reaction. Just go away. Good luck to them. Off they go to Mars. But unfortunately, the other 8 billion people in the world don't have that option. Now, Bill Gates has published a book. He has very considerable resources to do so and a team to write and research it for him. And it's a very plausible book. David will no doubt be telling us a lot more about it in his contribution. Bill Gates is basically saying we don't need to do anything. Everything will be done for us. And I think that is a very, very dangerous attitude to take. And it's also counterintuitive that actually most people who understand the problem want to do their bit. Now Bill Gates just thinks that high technology, research and development will get us out of the problem. Now, most of the high technology he's talking about is uncertain, still in the conceptual stage. We shouldn't rely for our very survival, for our children and grandchildren's survival, on something which is purely might be a good idea. It's too risky. And in any event, it is too slow. We'll come back to Bill Gates and his claims. But let's have a look at another reaction. Easter Island is actually a very, very good case study for what happens to a community when their whole environment is becoming unsupportable. The Polynesians colonised Easter Island in about 1200 AD. They built up to a population of about 15,000 people. They built lots of statues. They actually cut lots of trees down to use as rollers to get the statues into the right place. Easter Island was entirely forested at the time. They also cut lots of trees down to make dugout canoes, which they used for fishing. Eventually, all the forest was gone. They didn't manage to do anything about it. The pitifully low population, which had dwindled to about 2,000 people by the time Westerners arrived, spent their time fighting each other over the remaining resources. I feel that that is actually the way the world is going, unless we can do something better. And that is what we can do better. I'm sure you all remember Concorde and the great excitement that we could get to New York before we'd left London. How wonderful it was. And then, well, it was already becoming old technology, the planes were tired, and the French crash in the late 90s, I don't remember quite when, put the seal on it. But what is really significant is that no one complained, they just accepted, well, we had that, it was very good, but no more. And that is what we should get to decide for ourselves. The 20th and 21st centuries have given a wonderful standard of living. The fact you can go to Prague for a booze up any weekend you want, that was great. Well, if you like that sort of thing, but we're not going to have it. Let's go back to Bill Gates. Now, actually, I can see David scribbling an awful lot, and that does actually slightly worry me. But I am minded that David has to prove his case. If he can't prove and persuade you guys that we will reach all these high technologies, will achieve what we need before 2050, well, I think you would have to feel that we will either have personal suffering or have to make personal sacrifices. Now, Bill Gates is saying essentially that personal efforts aren't worth the bother because, you know, if you give up meat, well, just hippies and people in sandals do that. Well, if you look at these figures, if we all gave up meat, that takes off 6% of the world's climate emissions. Stop flying? Nothing. Everybody stops flying? 2%. Stop heating our houses? Bit chilly? 4%. Give up cars and just bicycle? 7%. That's a total of 19%. 20% with rounding errors. This is Bill Gates' claim that, well, that's all that you can achieve, so we've got to use high tech. But even if we gave up 20%, that would be a significant achievement. I suggest, however, that Bill Gates might be really very disingenuous. This lady, you've probably never seen or heard of her, but she is incredibly influential, a top American politician, Secretary of State for Energy for the world's biggest economy and second biggest carbon emitter. She says that focusing on individual responsibility is what the big polluters want us to do. Well, because it gets the big polluters off the hook. Well, actually, that's all very well, until you realise that some people have very large carbon footprints. Bill Gates, he admits to having a very large carbon footprint. He says, essentially, well, that's my little indulgence. And anyway, I'm a terribly important man, so I've got to fly around a lot. That one, UK average, that's actually, well, I assumed I'm Mr. Average. I measured my own carbon footprint, and I'm not terribly virtuous, but I'm about at the average. So, well, even if I could probably shave mine a little down, but certainly Bill Gates could do a lot. If you look at these figures on the left, can you see them all?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Bill Gates, partially, he is either deliberately or he's just being used to make the point that, well, let's get big business under the screw and let's not look at our own house get our own house in order. There's another issue though, it's not just the technologies, there's also speed. You can see here, we need to drop our carbon reductions every year. If we wait 15 or 20 years for the new R&D to come through, then the CO2 stays in the atmosphere, we'll have got that significant amount of carbon in the atmosphere, so we'll have to go into carbon sequestration to an even greater extent. The CO2, broadly, once it's in the atmosphere, it's there forever. Now, there is another rich man's think tank called Rethink X. This particular think tank believes that we should just rely on available technologies. Rethink X, I should say, it's a think tank organised by the man who used to own Invesco Perpetual, who are a fund manager, and he did very well before he sold it off, so we think he's probably very good at spotting good investments. You see the X curve there. His experience is that any new technology, if it's economically viable, will only take about 15 years from introduction before it dominates the market. So if you put on the X-axis there, for example, video players and DVDs, it takes about that length of time to make the transition. It's therefore supposed that with these oven-ready technologies, such as electricity, where we do know how we can get to net zero generating electricity, and with transport, we know how to make electric cars. If you let the market rip in 15 years, and we're probably already 5 years into that space, then all will be well. He also suggests that getting rid of conventional agriculture and relying on factory-made food, in other words, you put soya into a big container and out come nutritious, tasty meals, that will release so much farmland that can be rewilded and act as a carbon sink. Well, somehow I just don't feel confident that, given the free market, that this will all happen at the speed which Rethink believe is possible. I'm shortly to run out of time, so I'm not going to run through my opinions of the new technologies. You're going to have to see the slides as I quickly flick through to my final slide. Concrete, interestingly, is 7% of the carbon footprint, and no one seems to know how to make it. Equally, steel. without releasing lots of CO2. And hydrogen, well, anyone want a ticket on the Hindenburg? Kind of dangerous to expect hydrogen to do very much for us. Sorry, that's the sort of thing my sons would put up. Carbon sequestration, I'll leave David to talk about that. But this is my final thought. Here we are, park railings being removed in 1940. It turns out they weren't ever used to make Spitfires. It's even alleged that they were dumped in the Thames estuary. But the important thing is that people wanted to do their bit. They were willing to embrace sacrifice. And I suggest to you that that is how we should look at climate change and the sacrifices that will be required. I think many people want the leadership from government and are willing to make the reductions. If they made the reductions spontaneously, then the economy would collapse, because we are needed by the oligarchs to keep the economy running, to keep that demand up. Now that's a little bit of socialism that crept out there. But it doesn't matter, it's just good political thought. Even capitalists would agree that you need the markets. You need people to buy things. We don't want a catastrophic switch off, but we certainly want a lot more switching off than David is going to tell us is going to happen. Thank you.
I think Simon turned the timer off just as he was in the middle of his talk. He could overrun slightly. David is going to speak against the motion. I'll start it up nominally.
Sorry, Phil, do we need the fire door to be open? Because there's quite a lot of noise coming in.
Sounds as though there's a real storm going on back there.
Isn't it the rain that you're...
Yeah.
Or whatever it is.
So you'd like me to shut the door?
Yeah.
I think that's against the COVID, the hotel's COVID.
You can hear it on the windows, it's not the door.
Okay.
It's the rain on the window.
I'm sorry about that. We were advised to keep the ventilation high.
It's a bit quieter at the front, maybe. There are still some more spaces.
It's climate change, you know.
David doesn't have to take account of that in his timing. Are you ready?
Had a tornado or a flood or something.
Yeah.
Well, Caroline Lucas said on the radio this morning, it's not about sacrifice, it's about win-win solutions. Well, my main concern about tonight's motion is that it frames the climate crisis in religious terms. It's long been recognised that climate change has taken on the attributes of secular religion. It has an apocalyptic vision of the future, literally a fiery vision of hell in which we will all be boiled alive, and this will come about in the not too distant future because of human wickedness. The sins of the fathers, that's us, will be visited upon our children and grandchildren. No wonder they're terrified, just as children in the past were terrified by stories about hell. Climate change religion has a belief structure known as the scientific consensus, and anyone who deviates from this in the slightest degree is suspected of heresy and denounced as a climate denier, much like those who denied the doctrine of the Trinity 200 years ago. And it has a theory of salvation, which is that we should all repent of our evil ways and adopt an austere lifestyle, much like John the Baptist, who wore a garment of camel's hair and whose diet consisted of locusts and wild honey. I'm not sure where to get wild locusts, but you can get wild honey at Waitrose and Sainsbury's. Climate change religion even has its own Bernadette of Lourdes, in the person of Greta Thunberg, but maybe I'm getting a bit carried away with my theme. You've probably heard Christians claiming that God is real by pointing to all the wonderful things, even miraculous things that have happened in their lives. And as atheists and rationalists, we can go, ho, 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 what a ridiculous way to think. It's just an exercise in confirmation bias. But pointing to extreme weather events and saying that's evidence of climate change is just as ridiculous and unscientific. Day-to-day weather variability is not climate. The definition of climate is weather trends documented over decades. So next time you hear someone say, just look at all the news reports of floods, fires and droughts, we're all doomed, ask to see the long-term data trends over the last 100 years. And I think you'll be surprised by some of the evidence which goes against the popular narrative. Just because climate change has taken on the likeness of a religion doesn't mean that environmental catastrophe is impossible. We came very close to environmental catastrophe with the hole in the ozone layer. This was fixed by an international agreement called the Montreal Protocol, which was signed in 1987. But turning global warming into a religion is the least effective way to deal with the problem. Preaching at people to turn from their evil ways and to live henceforth in sackcloth and ashes simply doesn't work. At best, the people being preached at will make a few token gestures, such as reducing their meat consumption and recycling their plastic bags. I'm afraid the Tesco solution, every little helps, will do very little to solve the problem. 12 years ago, in January 2009, I gave a talk on climate change to Dorset Humanists at Moordown Community Centre. Some of you may remember it. I know Paul was there and challenged me at the time. I remember it well. And since then, I've debated the topic with science journalist Peter Hadfield and presented the basic physics of global warming on our Dorset Humanist Science course in 2019. 10 years before that, in 2009, I took a mildly sceptical approach because we were in the middle of the so-called global warming pause, which lasted from about 1998 to about 2014. Since then, global average temperature has continued to rise. In 2009, the average increase above pre-industrial times was usually quoted at 0.8 degrees centigrade, and now we're at about 1.1 degrees. Not all of this is attributed to greenhouse gas emissions, but we can be fairly certain that some of it is, just because of the basic physics of CO2 molecules, which intercept and re-radiate infrared energy as it bounces off the surface of the Earth. I don't want to get into computer model projections of what's likely to happen in 2050 or 2100 if we continue business as usual. Climate models are probably a complete waste of money because they can't model the atmosphere at anything like the required granularity. Continuing my religious theme, climate models look like a form of prophecy or even astrology. They predict and are therefore compatible with the full spectrum of future possibilities. So it looks like an exercise in unfalsifiability. From a scientific point of view, it's far better to look at the actual data. And when we look at the data, we can see that global average temperature has increased by about 0.3 degrees since I gave my talk in 2009. And I think we're right to be concerned about that. Johan Rockström, the Swedish Earth System scientist endorsed by Greta Thunberg, writes about a possible domino effect in his book Breaking Boundaries. He admits that this domino effect is scientifically plausible rather than scientific fact. But if a domino effect were to take hold, and if we did push the Earth back into a hothouse state, last seen in the Eocene epoch 50 million years ago when temperatures rose by 7 degrees, or the Cretaceous period 100 million years ago when temperatures were up to 15 degrees hotter than today, then I think we can all agree that it would be game over for human civilization as we know it. So even though I remain somewhat sceptical about climate change, especially because of the way in which it has been turned into a religion, and also because scepticism is one of the core virtues of science and humanism, I do think that aiming for net zero by 2050 is probably a prudent thing to do, as long as we don't dismantle civilization in the process. The rational and humanistic solution to the problem is not to go back to the Stone Age, but to ramp up our efforts at transforming the economy so that we can regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The first thing we need to do is to get over our irrational fear of nuclear energy. Despite the Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters, both of which arose from design faults which were known in advance by the UK Atomic Energy Authority, nuclear energy is one of the safest and most efficient methods of generating electricity. Nuclear power plants require only a tiny fraction of the land, cement, steel and glass required for wind and solar, and they don't suffer from intermittency. If you want to keep the lights on without fossil fuels, then we're going to have to ramp up our nuclear sector, and I'm pleased to see that nuclear is now routinely included in government pronouncements, unlike Germany, which is phasing out its nuclear plants and seeing its carbon emissions rise. I've heard reports that around 100 nuclear plants are being built or are in the planning stage, mostly in China and India. That sounds like good news. And new types of nuclear reactor are being developed, such as the stable salt reactor designed by Moltex Energy. It's cheap to build and completely safe, and it can be delivered on the back of a lorry. It can produce 100 times more electricity than a conventional nuclear power plant for a given input of uranium, and it can run on the nuclear waste of old-style reactors for the next 400 years. The snag is that the earliest it could be deployed in the UK is in about 10 years' time, but that's well within our 2050 flight path. If you want to do just one thing for the climate, then get yourself up to speed with new nuclear technology and start agitating for it. Nuclear power and offshore wind could be a winning combination, with nuclear providing electricity when the wind stops blowing. I'm worried about wind turbines killing birds and insects, and from an aesthetic point of view, I think they're an eyesore. But Rockstrom writes that offshore wind power is probably the most significant breakthrough in recent years. It could supply more than enough electricity to meet the world's demands, plus an additional 50%. That's an amazing forecast. And Bill Gates writes that the UK is the world's biggest user of offshore wind today. So it's good to hear that the UK is leading the field in at least one sector. Nuclear fusion could also play a part. The biggest current fusion project is in the south of France, a collaboration between the EU and 6 other countries. It's at least a decade away from supplying electricity to consumers, but when it does, it will be cheap and plentiful because the hydrogen that's usually used in fusion can be extracted from seawater. Geothermal is another possibility, but it's more viable in places like Iceland than the UK for obvious reasons. Another technology of the future, which is already here today on a small scale, is direct air capture of CO2. At today's prices, it would cost about $5 trillion to suck 50 billion tonnes of CO2 out of the atmosphere every year. That's about 6% of global GDP. So even now it's affordable, at least in theory, but as the technology develops, the cost will come down and this solution can be scaled up. We'll need to build around 50,000 direct air capture plants around the world and then store billions of tonnes of CO2. Bill Gates, who writes about it in his book How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, agrees that we can't wait for direct air capture to save us, but it's likely to be playing an important role by 2050. Now, one of Simon's points is that we don't have the time to wait for all this new technology to come on stream. He told me some weeks ago, and really tonight as well, that we can't bet on this. Well, I'll make a number of points in response. The first is that his solution, personal sacrifice, won't fix the problem. Getting everyone's carbon footprint down to about 4 tonnes of CO2 a year would require everyone to live at subsistence level. And even this drastic reduction in living standards is nowhere near enough. If we're going to get to net zero, we would need to get everyone's carbon footprint into negative territory. That basically means dismantling human civilization, killing off about 7 billion people, and going back to the tropics where we came from 40,000 years ago. Maybe this is what some people want, but it's neither rational nor humanistic. The rational solution is to enable 8 billion people on the planet to enjoy a decent standard of living whilst decarbonising at source. This is the only rational solution to the problem, and we're not starting from scratch. According to Rockstrom, we're already in the middle of a great transformation. What we need to do in the next 10 years is increase funding to research and development so that by the time we get to 2030, the exponential curve will kick in. We're already seeing it with electric cars. If we can get onto the right flight path by 2030, then we'll be able to hit the net zero landing strip by 2050. But I agree we're not on the right flight path at the moment. Whether COP26 will make a difference remains to be seen. But what I'll be looking for is a commitment to increase R&D funding by a factor of 5 to around $100 billion a year. We shouldn't just be relying on billionaires like Bill Gates to invest in technological innovation. Generating electricity is of course just one part of the decarbonisation agenda. Virtually everything we do creates greenhouse gas emissions. Simon is right to argue that we don't yet have all the technology that we need. But Rockstrom is optimistic. We're not starting from scratch. The energy revolution began 30 years ago and it's now reached takeoff speed. Population growth is slowing and the technology revolution is unstoppable. He believes that we need a so-called Earthshot mission to stabilise the Earth. He writes about exponential change, which is deceptively slow at the beginning, until you reach the knee or the elbow of the curve when things begin to take off. He believes that the next decade is on course for the fastest economic, social, political and technological transformation in history. Welcome to the roaring 2020s, he writes. Well, I said at the start that my main concern about tonight's motion is that it frames the climate crisis in religious terms. Climate change religionists will be resistant to any technological solution which lets us off the hook by giving us limitless carbon-free energy, because then we'll simply find other ways to trash the planet. Well, I agree. We do need to live within planetary boundaries, even if we start extracting resources from adjacent planets like Mars. But according to Rockstrom, we can have our cake and eat it. We can have a universal prosperity for 8 billion people, but we do need to live within planetary boundaries. This doesn't mean going back to the Stone Age, it means going forward into an age of much smarter technology, which reduces our impact on the natural environment. I believe that this is an approach which is in tune with Enlightenment humanism, and because it's an uplifting and not optimistic aim, I believe that there's a much greater chance of getting human beings to buy into it, rather than the depressing hair-shirt message of some environmentalists. So in this spirit, I urge you and Simon to vote against the motion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to both speakers. I think I agreed with everything everybody said. I'm now going to abandon the idea of timing the speakers, because that didn't work very well, did it? And I'll just, what I'll allow them to do is to each respond to the other's initial speech for about 5 minutes each. Say 5 or 10 minutes.
Yes, yeah, well, maybe up to 10 minutes. And then
Yeah, up to 10 minutes, and then we'll have, a comfort break. So first of all, Simon, are you happy to?
Okay, can you hold the console? Well,
Do you want to sit next to each other?
would you be able to come and add to my speech?
Briefly. Do you mind being going to hold? That makes 10 minutes from them collectively. And then 10 minutes.
No, I'll only be about 2 minutes.
You're the chairman, you make the decision.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it fair for you. I think you can take it.
Yeah,
I don't mind, yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Yes. 2 minutes from you, and then wait.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, it's all right, I think.
Okay, I don't know where this came from, this idea it's a quasi-religion. Perhaps it was an unfortunate choice of... perhaps I fell into David's trap. When we agreed the wording of the motion, I didn't see sacrifice as a religious concept, just giving up something that you like. Hair shirts, well, no. I think it's a complete mistake to frame this as a religious issue, and equally to look at this as though we've done bad and therefore it's time we had our comeuppance. It is simply we've got a problem and we have to pull together to resolve that problem. The other point I think is important to correct in what David said is that I'm certainly not suggesting that we don't use new technology. So it isn't a matter of inviting everybody in the planet to go back to the Stone Age and give up everything. It is a matter that we reduce as quickly as possible, commensurate with bringing in the new technologies, and then Mr. Rongstrom's enthusiasm for new technologies can be great. If we've got electric powered planes and they work and they don't trash the planet, well, let's use them. But I just think that that David is being extremely complacent to think that we will have the technologies in time, and time is running out already. 2050 is only a particular arbitrary date, and therefore the as we can manage things to reduce our carbon footprints, the better. And that's really all I have to say, but my colleague Jeremy has a couple of words that he might add as well.
Okay. Hello, I'm Jeremy May. I'm not actually a fully fledged Dorset humanist. I am an agnostic, so perhaps I've no right to be here and lecture all of you. But anyway, I'll give it my best shot.
Agnostics are admissible.
Well, I'm very relieved to hear that. Going back to Simon's example of Easter Island, and the way that the inhabitants of Easter Island have destroyed their environment, and the fact that they simply couldn't cooperate to do anything to restore that severely damaged environment. We have to look at our own situation today, which geopolitical situation, which mirrors what happened in Easter Island. It is desperately important that the whole world unites to try to combat climate change. Climate change is a given, I believe, and we can't just ignore it or think it's not going to happen. It's already out there and already affecting our lives quite dramatically. So I believe it's an absolute given that we have to do our utmost to get every nation on board to combat this gross threat to our planetary existence. And when I look at the way that our government and the American government is behaving right now, I'm appalled. I'm appalled at the fact that that we are still members of NATO, which I think is an absolutely absurd organisation, because its sole mission, it seems, or brief, is to combat and vilify the Soviet Union. That's ridiculous. So what if there are differences between us and Russia? We desperately need to, both of us, need to unite in order to save the planet from this deadly threat that faces us. Ditto in the case of China. We've just, again, through American pressure, we have signed an agreement, a pact with Australia, the US, called the AUKUS pact, AUKUS, or I don't even know how to pronounce that word, and which is intended primarily, very obviously, and the Americans are making no bones about this, it is to contain China's supposedly aggressive intentions. Well,
I think you need to come back to the topic, Jeremy.
All right.
Mainly want to talk about getting climate change. Not everything geopolitical.
Well, this is very relevant, actually.
Well, everything's relevant in a way, but I'd quite like it just to be about how we achieve net zero.
Well, through better international cooperation. We've got to get Russia and China on board. Okay? We've got this COP26 conference coming up in the next few days and few weeks. And it's desperately important, but it is a success. Now, is that irrelevant?
No, okay.
All right. So, So anyway,
All right, sorry.
do you want to take over now, Simon? I don't mind. It's up to you.
If you've got another point to make, please do, Joe.
Well, what I really wanted to talk about also is that we need to put pressure on the third world, because the third world is in denial. They are hopelessly dependent on fossil fuels. They're very ignorant of any kind of new technology, particularly the sort of stuff that David has been talking about. And it's going to be tremendously expensive for the West to try to bring them up to speed. I don't see that happening. I don't think we've got the financial resources to educate the third world, to subsidise the transition to a green economy in the way David might think is necessary and desirable. So there's the issue of countering the third world dependence on fossil fuels, how to get them off that trend. There is foreign aid, which is a tool we can use to pressurize them to make that transition away from fossil fuels. There's also the issue of international trade. We import a lot of imports from Brazil in particular, and some of the stuff that we import, as I think most of us know already, is actually used in the manufacture of vegetable products that we use for diet and all the rest of it. So you can buy these in Tesco, incidentally. So there are lots of ways we can pressurize a country like Brazil, for instance, to get its act together and stop laying waste to the Amazon jungle and cutting down every tree that there is, which is another desperate measure that we need to work on. Anyway, I'll hand it over to you, Simon.
Thank you.
You finish that.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to hand over to David now to do his response.
Thanks very much. Okay, I mean, I was interested that Simon was using phrases like people want to do their bit, and I was very rude about this. I called it the Tesco solution, every little helps. It won't solve the problem, but to be fair to Simon, he did say that even if we could shave, let's say, 20% off CO2 emissions, that would be helpful. Okay, fair enough. But I think the bigger point I was making, but then I think this is where some common ground is emerging between us, because Simon has said in his response that he's not saying that we don't need the technology. He's kind of saying, well, let's do what we can now to before the technology arrives, kind of thing. But I was interested that Simon, he revealed his own carbon footprint, which obviously sounds very much smaller than Bill Gates's footprint. Let's just defend Bill Gates just a little bit. I know it's gargantuan footprint, obviously, and he's very open and honest about this. I'm sure he's coming to COP26 in his private jet and all the rest of it. He claims to have offset all of it. Well, okay, you may or may not believe that, whether that's planting 10,000 trees or whatever it is. But he has also spent billions of his own money on innovation and innovating solutions. He says that that's his contribution, if you like. So whether you accept that or not, but I just thought I would mention that. Okay, so Simon said that I think he said he could, so to personalise this, could shave some of the carbon off his own carbon footprint from 11 tonnes. The last time I calculated my carbon footprint, it was 7 tonnes. So I don't think I'm being complacent. But I don't think this is about personal virtue. It's probably just about lifestyle and your own circumstances. People will live in whatever way is commensurate with their income. I mean, Aaron published his own carbon footprint in Humanistically Speaking, which I hope you're all reading avidly, because we've done a complete issue on the climate this month. And Aaron's carbon footprint was about 4 tonnes per annum. So, but is that because Aaron is, particularly virtuous? He's actually given up his Bentley and he's given up his vast, his vast sort of acreage and all the rest of it. But, the point I'm making is that it's probably not so much about virtue, but more about personal circumstances. Okay, Simon wanted me to prove it. Well, I didn't prove it with sort of facts and figures, but I gave a sort of broad brush sort of message tonight. I was a bit concerned when Simon said, he was talking about Prague, saying that we're not going to be able to, I think he was saying we're not going to be able to go there anymore, for these piss-ups, whatever. Well, I don't know what that, it would be interesting, maybe we can talk about what does that actually mean in terms of everyone here, in terms of your travel plans. Does it mean you can't go abroad? Does it mean you can't fly? Does it mean it's okay if you go on a train? Does it mean you can't go to COP26 on a plane as long as you go by horse and cart or a bike or whatever? So all of these things maybe we can discuss. I think I'm nearly there, but I want to respond to something Jeremy said. He's talked about putting pressure on the third world to sort of move off fossil fuels. Once the technological solutions are cheaper than fossil fuels, the market will do the trick. They won't want fossil fuels once nuclear or whatever the solution is, nuclear fusion or whatever, is much cheaper than fossil fuels. The market will do the trick. I'm not, the greatest sort of free market advocate, but in this case, I think that there's an important point to be made there. So it's not about putting moral pressure on countries. It's about getting states and governments now really behind the technological innovation. Let's get the billions of dollars into the innovation. Get these things to market. We got vaccines to market in lightning speed. We could do the same with some of these new nuclear technologies and other technologies. Even if we don't, it's only 10 years away. I say only 10 years away. Our flight path is 2050. Even if these things come on stream in 10 years' time, things are really taking off. Wind power has taken off. All of these other things can take off as well. We can then mop up. Simon said that CO2, once it's in the atmosphere, it's there forever. That's not technically true. It does eventually drop out. But we already have the technology to get CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's a natural way, which is plants. That technology has existed for hundreds of billions of years, and CO2, as you all know, is a good fertilizer, and the world is actually greening considerably because of the increase in CO2. I'm not saying that means it's not also warming the planet, but we also have artificial means of sucking CO2 directly out of the air. We're already doing it, but at the moment it's a bit too expensive. We need to crack that up so that we can mass produce these machines. You can all have a CO2 sucking machine in your back garden, and that will help to solve the problem. Okay, that's enough for me. Thank you very much.
So the plan now is to take a break. You can have a comfort break, you can have a drink, we can just relax for 10 minutes, and then we will come back and you can pound the speakers with your questions. Okay?
I mean, this has really been intended just to get people talking, and I think it's worked that way. And I wouldn't want David to feel disheartened.
Well, I mean, neither of us knew what we were going to say tonight, so we had an inkling, I think, but we hadn't compared notes. So, if to some degree we may have been talking past each other, that's the reason. But I think we had a reasonable sort of meeting of minds. Or not meeting of minds, but we sort of knew where we were going with it. So.
Okay, so I'll stand up so that I can try and organise proceedings in some way. It's like herding cats, isn't it? Aaron put his hand up first, and then John. Okay, I've got 5, 6 people, 7.
Is this
You're not voting. You're asking if you want to ask the speakers a question. then let them elaborate a bit. Preferably not too long in each one, gentlemen, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Then we can. Right. So we'll start with Aaron.
Okay. Question for Simon. David came up with the technology and all this prediction. You didn't have anything. You just said that people should do more, and then had no way of saying how that was going to be. So, is this the government saying you will do this? Is it Greta Thunberg or people lying in front of the road saying, if you don't do what we'll say, we'll block your traffic? What is your? How do you get people to do what you want people to do? Time up.
We're a very liberalist country. You remember 18 months ago, a local MP talked to us about that. But I think most people want to do the right thing, and with good leadership, they will do it. Whether you actually make it a law, probably you don't in this country, but perhaps Far Eastern Asian countries would. I would love to change for the dialogue to change so that we all look at our carbon footprints, at the decisions we take on a daily basis. I'd like it to be the case that if someone flies off to Prague or anywhere else, they will feel they have to justify it to their friends. One particular example is of tobacco. It used to be the case that everybody smoked, or it was common to smoke. Now, if someone smokes, they are embarrassed and they feel they have to justify it to other people. I think that the dialogue will move eventually so that people feel personally embarrassed if their carbon footprint is high and cannot be justified.
3.68 tonnes. Thank you very much.
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
I just don't want to live in that kind of world, where we're all judging each other. I mean, I think, people have their own lifestyles, people make their own decisions, people have got different incomes. If somebody... Well, to be honest, I am a bit judgmental about my brother who rides around in this ridiculous great big SUV thing that he doesn't need. So yes, there are some times when I am a bit judgmental, but generally speaking, I don't want us to live in that kind of world. I want people should make their own decisions, but I don't want to get into the kind of world where we're all judging each other for, going on holiday, or if somebody here wants to go to fly to Australia to see their grandchildren, I'm not going to judge you. If you just go for a shopping trip to New York, possibly, because that seems a bit trivial, but
Well, I think you've given the game away.
Maybe
You are
I have.
judging.
maybe I am a little bit, but
Yes.
I don't want.
And we have a world where we judge each other all the time, in any event.
My last
If we
flight
go
was
back to the
1990.
war-
When was your last? How many have you had in the last 30 years?
How many?
My last flight was 1990. How many have you had in the last 30 years?
Well, I can't. I think. Are we trying to get into personal?
No,
judging?
you just said about embarrassing people. I was just giving you your own treatment.
I haven't. No, actually, I made a resolution about 2 years ago, and this probably does seem a bit pious, that I will not fly again.
Good man.
I guess you made that resolution a long time before me.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just make one correction on carbon footprints?
Okay.
That actually there are two ways they're measured. They are measured by the actual emissions which you are personally responsible for within the UK, and then that was, I suspect, what Aaron and David's carbon footprints are, or you can have one that factors in the fact that we export about half this country's carbon footprint, so that the CO2 is generated in China and other places of mass production, and that accounts for my rather higher carbon footprint.
We'd have to test that, but anyway,
Yes. Okay, so I think the next one on the hand up was John.
Yeah.
This is more in the nature of perhaps giving you some information, partly why we're in the situation we are now with such, high carbon CO2 emissions. And I don't know if any of you know this, but the fossil fuel industry benefits from subsidies of $11 million every minute.
Yeah.
Every minute. And that's an analysis by the International Monetary Fund, which came out this month, so it's current. The IMF found the production and burning of coal, oil and gas was subsidised by $5.9 trillion in 2020, with not a single country pricing all its fuels sufficiently to reflect their full supply and environmental costs. So this is one of the big problems. And then you have to ask, well, what's happening to all that money? Because the oil companies make huge, huge profits. And they use quite a substantial amount of that money to spread what's called FUD, fear, uncertainty and doubt, and influence public opinion that, the climate crisis isn't real. And they have been doing this like the tobacco industry did. They've borrowed their tactics and they've used those tactics to influence people's opinion on whether there really is climate change or not. And on top of that, they also use their money to corrupt politicians. So, politicians will be offered very lucrative directorships when they leave office, or they'll be offered vast sums of money to go and talk at a conference that the oil companies are putting on. We are all of us are in the pockets of the big oil companies, and they are largely responsible not just for digging and bringing the fossil fuels out of the ground, but for doing their very best to ensure that that goes on for as long as possible.
Yeah.
That covers eco-boilers as well, that there's so much furore against subsidising all the fuels that we have now, which will comparatively, as we stand, make the new eco-boilers that we're aiming at seem inappropriately expensive. But if you take all those subsidies away, including the ones that go to gas and move them to electricity, the eco-boilers aren't nearly as expensive when they come online as it looks as if they will.
Right.
And that's just an example of exactly what you've said.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. Right, you were next, I think.
Anyway, firstly, I'd like to thank both speakers. When I listened to Simon, at the end of it, I said, I'm going to support the motion. And then David spoke, and I said, no, I think I'll support him. So where am I on this debate? And I think, as usual, sort of both speakers, both motions, are bringing very, very valid points. My own personal view is, as an engineer, as a scientist, I think that the global warming problem will be solved by technology, by engineers, and by scientists. That is where the solution will come. But the solution will only come if collectively everybody believes that there is a problem. Because, on the religious aspect, belief is a tremendously powerful emotion, and it drives change, it drives things, it creates things. So the technologists and the engineers that need to come up with these solutions, it won't happen unless collectively, as humankind, we believe that there is a problem. So I think you need both arguments in order to come up with the solution. On the aspect of, and I think it was Simon brought it up, there is an analogy here of what happened during the war, and I sort of relate to stories that my parents and my grandparents spoke and everything like that. They were united by common cause, by a common theme that you were in danger and everybody came together. Now, I'm sure, my father and my brother, they didn't crack, and my grandparents didn't crack the Enigma code, but they did their bit in order that they felt right, that they were being part of this solution that was the threat that was being made. And I think the positive thing that will come out, it will unite, I think, nations, it will unite people in a common cause to be involved in this thing. So you need both aspects. You need the, ultimately, where the solutions are going to come from. You know, it's going to come from technology, it's going to come from engineering. But in order for that to happen, you need to unite the people in a common cause, which is what is happening now. So I guess where I am, I'm sitting on the fence on both arguments.
Thank you. Yeah, you certainly need that in order for people to make the sacrifices as well as to develop the technologies. Jeremy, do you want to respond to that?
How many minutes can I speak for? 5 seconds?
No, you're brief, yes, please. Yeah, because we've got lots of other people.
I'm not going to say anything which is not relevant, or try not to anyway. What I wanted to bring up is the issue of wishful thinking, and with all due respect, I'm sorry, what was your name?
Jeff.
Everything you said is, as far as I'm concerned, just wishful thinking. You hope, you expect, you think, you believe, etc., etc. I'm sorry to be blunt, if you like, but you've got no proof, no hard evidence to prove that any of this innovation, of this research and development, will materialise in time for us to achieve net zero by whenever it is, 2050.
Jeremy, I'm going to interject. I just think that's ridiculous. It's already materialising. You know, we've already got nuclear energy, and we know that is very, very low carbon energy. We've already got a lot of this technology. It's not as if we're just waiting for 10 years.
Well, I think we're all waiting for Godot, I think, to a large extent, because apart from those examples you just mentioned, I can't think of any drastic or major technological innovation that has been achieved regarding climate change. Okay, you mentioned.
That's not true. It's,
all right.
It's that there is a lot of.
There's wind power.
There is a lot of
Air Capture. All of these technologies we've already got.
No, please. You can only talk about climate capture, DAC, or whatever you call it, and monitors, and that's all you can cite as evidence, as proof that technology can save us. And I'm sorry, I need a lot more convincing to subscribe to this. Now, could I just say this to you?
Yeah, okay.
Because I didn't want to get sidetracked.
No, I think you're right, and I'm going to be chairman and say I agree with part of what you say and move on to someone else. But because I think wishful thinking is a huge problem on both sides. Because I think it's wishful thinking to think that people will suddenly become more moral and make sacrifices of their own accord just because they think it's a good idea. There's a certain amount of wishful thinking in some of the technologies you talk about, but you're right.
But the big point I'm making is that we've heard nothing. I think Aaron was making it as well. We've heard nothing from Simon's side on other than doing your bit, which is just tinkering with the problem by making a bit of sacrifice here and there. That's totally unrealistic. That's complete wishful thinking as well. I'm not saying that it's not a good thing to do your bit, but the really big solutions are going to be technological. That's the overall message I've got.
May I respond to that?
Yeah. Well, sorry.
Hard to organise if we just jump around here. But
of course.
Short response and I'll move on to the floor.
Well, David has changed the debate now. His job was to prove that essentially that we can do it all with high tech. It's not my job to show how we're going to do it by personal sacrifice, and it is quite. It's always been my stance that we may need personal sacrifice, but that's not exclusive to technology.
I think it might be your responsibility to show how you're going to make everybody make those personal sacrifices, because I don't think they will. I think any opportunity they can take to decide it's somebody else's problem and they should make the personal sacrifices, they will do so. So I think it's wishful thinking to think that everyone, in the words of the motion, will make the sacrifices that are expected of them. There's got to be some mechanism to perhaps what Jeff said is get people on board by having beliefs about the problem, perhaps by some political means.
Particularly the third one, you see. How are we going to convince them?
No, well, Jeremy's right. The third one's a big issue.
Could I just make one final
Are we going to have questions? Or?
I think the idea is to move on to other
okay,
questions.
but ROG, which is rapid population growth, that is the elephant in the room, which we haven't really talked about. And that is
Population growth is an important problem. We ought to have another meeting about that.
And Bill Gates actually 3 years ago, when his official mouthpiece was still the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, actually admitted that. He said, yes, we need to reduce world population by 3 billion people in order to comfortably have any expectation that we can control climate change. That's what he said. He's a very disingenuous individual, and he's now trying to backtrack and pretend he never said that, but he did. It's all on.
Okay. Thank you. No, we're going around the room, please. Yeah.
First of all, a mathematical point of order for David. Exponential curves don't have elbows or knees.
I'm really disappointed.
They grow smoothly and they accelerate, but there's no sudden kinks. I was found a lot of David's points quite bizarre, because I've seen David speak lots of times and he's a great speaker and I always learn a lot. And you came up with several very bizarre comments. Like at the start, Phil assured us that we weren't going to waste any more time debating whether or not climate change was a thing. And then you seemed to spend the first 4 or 5 minutes trying to convince us that it wasn't, before begrudgingly admitting, okay, maybe there is some climate change. And I don't think that your talk was alarmist enough, to be honest. And then I was bemused by, obviously in a debate of this sort, you need to know your audience. And you seem to try and think, well, I've got a lot of humanists here that are not religious people. So if I compare people on Simon's side to people who believe in the Bible, maybe I'll get some votes that way. And I don't accept that anyone who wants to make personal sacrifice can be paired to someone walking around in sackcloth. So that was a little bit disappointing. But to get back to which side of the debate we should go with, I kind of agree with Jeff that surely the point is that by making personal sacrifice, we show the leaders that we, the voters, care, and therefore we create the political will for them to get further along this exponential curve more quickly. And if we don't make personal sacrifice, we risk our leaders thinking that we don't care, and so they're not going to get any more votes by doing what needs to be done. And is that where we can kind of have some central ground here?
Yeah. We need to.
Simon, you need to want a short response.
Who's going first?
Well, Simon waved his hand first.
Okay.
Let Simon go first.
I felt Simon missed the main point of personal sacrifice, which is to allow David's people to take over.
If I may, this afternoon, having written my speech, I was reflecting, and I realised that actually the time is nigh. Oh, that's rather biblical, sorry. that normal people who feel strongly about this should actually club together and say, okay, we are going to monitor our personal climate footprints. We will deliberately work to a certain target. I think that that movement could spread worldwide very quickly, because Barney's absolutely right that there is a vast, probably a very, very large number of people who believe that something must be done and who don't think their governments are doing it properly. If I may, Jeff, I'm fully with you, Jeff. In the Second World War, okay, maybe a slight rosy glow about it from what my parents told me, people did club together. They accepted they had rations. There were spivs and cowboys who cheated the system, but by and large, people got on and fought the common fight. And that's an analogy you probably don't like, but it works. It's not a religion, it's a battle, if you like.
I mean, we could all have been monitoring our footprint, our carbon footprint, for the last, 15 years. I mean, and people haven't. It's been very easy. I don't know how many people. Let's have a show of hands. How many people have know what their carbon footprint is and have recently calculated their carbon footprint and know what they're supposed to be doing? Hands up, those of you who've done it.
Oh, surely it's not just
Come on.
If you haven't, it doesn't mean that you haven't been trying to reduce your carbon
Yeah,
footprint,
you don't have
just
to
because you can't
calculate
put a number
everything.
on it.
I do
Well,
quite a lot
true.
to try and reduce my carbon footprint. I
Okay.
don't actually know how much
Yeah, I mean,
by.
Every time you go somewhere by bicycle, you know that you're doing something slightly green.
I just think, I just keep coming back to this point that this whole mantra of doing your bit or every little helps is just too trivial for words. Simon hasn't really pointed out this evening exactly the scale of the sacrifice that he's talking about. We've had a couple of examples, not going to Prague and not flying. But if we're really talking about sacrifice, I did say in my talk, we actually have to get your footprint down to, let's say, 4 tons of CO2. We have to get down to the kind of lifestyle that you can afford on benefits. And even that is not enough. But okay, I agree that Simon has said it's not about getting it down to 0, it's about doing that then plus the technology. So I think we do have some common ground there. Just to respond to what you said, Barney, you said that my talk wasn't alarmist enough. I am coming back to, quite a lot of what I was saying was based on Johan Rockström. I don't know if you've seen him but he's done some brilliant video, some YouTube videos. He's a really important Earth system scientist. And when he was talking about this, all of the alarmism is based on this domino effect. That if we go past certain tipping points, then there'll be another tipping point, and another tipping point, and another tipping point. That's what Extinction Rebellion and people like Roger Hallam are talking about. Okay, it is very, very scary. But Johan Rockström, in this book, he is an Earth system scientist. He said, and I quote, "We know precious little about it, this domino effect." He said it's scientifically plausible. Okay, well, it's scientifically plausible. That's great, and it could have, it may or may not happen. So if I'm not being alarmist enough, it's because I'm taking the science from Rockström, and he is blessed by Saint Greta.
Say no more.
Simon.
Yes, I think 2 really good speeches, but I think it's completely false dichotomy, because obviously we're going to need the technology, but obviously we're going to need public opinion to be aware that it's a heck of a big problem. Because whether we make the sacrifices by walking or cycling, so taking the car or whatever it is, not flying so much, or whether we make the sacrifices by paying more taxes so that the god-awful sums of money can be spent that need to happen to change the whole terms of the economic playing field, either way we're going to be making sacrifices. And the real issue is that the international experts have agreed there is a climate crisis and that what humanity is doing is a major part of the cause. But the whole problem is actually about how you get the political will not to carry on exploring for oil and burning and coal and burning it all, and to and sacrifice. So how do you get the political will? Well, half of the world is some kind of a democracy, in which case it's vital that everybody is aware that we're moving towards the edge of a cliff. But half of the world is a dictatorship, like Russia, or Saudi Arabia, or various dodgy countries where a lot of this, the fossil fuels are. It's a completely false dichotomy. Both the speakers are correct in some of the things they've said, but the problem is how you persuade dictators and you persuade various democracies. As my friend said, many of whose politicians have been nobbled by incredibly generous grants to go on think tanks, funded by fossil fuel companies, the Koch brothers and all that. But the problem is how you achieve the political will, and the notion that everyone's got to make a sacrifice, or should make a sacrifice, is a very important part of that, I would argue.
Thank you.
I think I was going to go to Paul next, if he's still got a point.
I hope it'll result in a question. I was hoping to put forward one or two ideas that maybe put this into perspective, and I shall bow to the chair if you tell me to shut up.
Just not too long.
Where are we now? The carbon graph is doing that, right? We've known about this for years and years. Quite a lot of individuals have made personal sacrifices. They haven't made any difference to the graph at all. Various technological solutions have come along, specifically solar and wind, that have been exploited. They work very well in some particular countries, such as ours, and made a blind bit of difference to the graph. So neither of those two, in my view, are the answers. What the debate lacks, sorry, this isn't a comment about us, I mean the wider debate, is focus. Now I'd say first of all, what we absolutely have to have is what Jeremy was drawing attention to, which is international cooperation, because if we can't achieve that, the game changes completely and we've got a different discussion. So if I may assume that we've got some degree of international cooperation. David's sceptical of climate models, but what we can do, and we have enormous resources out there of thousands and thousands of committed scientists and politicians and economists who really want this to work, what we can do is we can identify the worst culprits and the main drivers creating carbon and methane and others, and the cheapest solutions to implement, and we can focus and prioritise. Now, a comment has been made about individual orientation, and I do think that's important, but it isn't really terribly important for what can be achieved. It's important for psychological reasons, and to, if you like, say, I'm in this game, and I'm trying to contribute, and I'm part of the discussion. Tech solutions are obviously coming, and they will unfold over decades. But to my knowledge, the sorts of items that David is talking about are not really quite commercially there. And we've been talking, for example, about carbon capture for years, probably decades. And I recognise that's progressing, but it's not there yet, even though there are functioning units, but they're very small scale and they're currently very expensive. Now, the example, to try and come to the point, is what I would do in relation to air flights. And we've had a discussion. On the one hand, we've got a liberal economy and we like to make our own decisions. On the other hand, I think we want to know that the issue is under control and we're making progress. So let's accept for a moment that air travel is a significant contributor to climate change, and it's certainly a significant contributor to messing up the atmosphere. So what do we do about it? We have a plan which is flexible and which unfolds. Now I would suggest that as of now the plan starts off and somebody has to do the numbers, and then you come up with a plan which says, right, the price of air fuel has to double every 5 years for the next 25 years in order to meet 1.5% as part of a much wider plan. So there's plenty of resource around to come up with those sorts of answers. We know that there is better fuel already on the way. It's being implemented, and there will be technological change. As and when technological change is folded in, then you update your plan, and maybe we reach a point where we don't have to put the price of fuel up anymore. Now, in the meantime, there will be nobody out there who's having to worry about saying your neighbour's a stinker because they went to Bali last year, because the market, the economics, takes care of it. You've decided the price you need, and that price determines how much people buy. And as an occasional economist, I think those are the sorts of solutions we have to try and look at. So my action plan for air fuel, which is artificially kept low at the moment since the Second World War, agreements on the subject would
Yeah.
be to get together and say, we've got to shift it. We've got to have tax on air fuel, and it's got to be pretty much the same tax in all jurisdictions. Now let's get on with it, and if the Isle of Man doesn't do it, then we screw them some other way.
Daniel was next.
Thank you. Yes, I think this debate kind of reminds me a little bit of Pascal's wager. The idea of a likelihood of, or a possibility of having an infinite reward or an infinite punishment, and if the scientists are right about climate change, then potentially we could have an infinite punishment of everyone dies, or they could all be wrong, which I think is extremely unlikely. The thing about Pascal's wager is that it isn't accurate, because there's no evidence for the existence of God, and it's just as equally likely that there's some other God that would be angry that you believed in a Christian God and would punish you for it, so that it kind of falls apart there. But there is evidence for climate change. There's more than zero evidence for it. Most scientists do agree with it. And I was concerned, David, about your comments about the cult of the scientific consensus. I do tend to trust the scientific consensus in almost all things. For instance, with medical consensus, I trust them that vaccines work, because I don't have a lab or an ability to do a large medical trial myself, but I trust that their ability to test that sort of thing is much better than my ability to Google it and read on blogs or whatever. Same thing with the shape of the Earth. I trust that it's round, even though I've never actually been to space myself, because I do trust that the good people at NASA know what they're talking about. And I just have to trust that the climate scientists can do a better job than I can personally in my house at figuring out what the truth is, because they've dedicated their lives to it and they've got colleagues.
I think the whole notion of a scientific consensus is unscientific, but anyway, we could debate that some other time. Yeah.
I think you're confusing it. Everybody agreeing with there being a consensus in the sense of a majority or a majority of.
I mean, the so-called 97% scientific consensus is a meaningless meme, and it has been debunked. But anyway, again, that's something.
You can't say that without allowing other people to challenge it. That's anyway. But that's an absurdity in my view, what you're saying.
Well, no, most scientists who dissent from some aspects of what purports to be the scientific. Well, most scientists who sometimes get labelled as climate deniers, if you actually ask them what they believe, they agree with all of the things that are in the scientific consensus. I mean, it's an absurdity.
I remember not that long ago. Well, when you debated this a few years ago, I remember you quoting Nigel Lawson, and as evidence that there were people who disagreed with, and he was paid for. You don't hear a lot about him anymore, but he was a climate change denier, who you were quoting at that time when you were challenging the scientific consensus.
Yeah, I mean, I did refer to my talk in 2009. That was 12 years ago, and I have shifted my position since then, as I made clear in my speech tonight.
Angela.
Yes, I was thinking that the teachers and they ought to. It ought to be taught in schools what we know about climate change, because the people it really affects are the children now. I mean, adults have had some sort of life, and things are getting very difficult, but if the children realise, and the schools and the teachers, that I think they'd support really drastic climate change.
Thank you. Yes. That's right. is mostly the children that are complaining, people like Greta Thunberg and school strikers.
I think there is a big danger in inducing fear within children. I mean, talking to my grandchildren, and they're fairly young, they really have a fear of the world is going to come to an end and everything like that, and they can't rationalise everything as we can with all the facts and everything like that. So it can have, I'm sure it will have an impact on them with regard to their mental health, that there is this threat that's going on and the fear that will create, and I can see that being a problem as those children grow up, because they don't have all the facts at their fingertips like we have the privilege of doing.
Well, the Earth will be just fine. It's humanity who will suffer.
Yes. A lot of people grew up with the threat of the Cold War and felt that any day now we could all be killed with a nuclear bomb. So we could look at how they turned out to see.
That's the boomers. Doesn't bode well.
They lived through the 70s and 80s. Yeah. I think Sally was next.
Okay. That's quite opposite, actually, the mention of the Cold War and the nuclear bomb. Because one thing I was thinking when David mentioned about how quickly things had got going over COVID, because everyone was suddenly prepared, they suddenly realised there was an immediate threat and something really had to be done right now, and they got on and did it very fast. And I was thinking about a Melvin Bragg in Our Time thing that I was listening to the other day about the Manhattan Project and the speed with which they got the atomic bomb, nuclear bomb, and the vast amount of organisation and money that was thrown at it in America, I mean, apart from everywhere else, in order to get it built along, and they did it with remarkable speed because the threat was real and they thought the Germans might be building it, they'd get there first and that would be the end. They had to do it, it was a real crisis, and they got on and actually did it. And I'm reminded of a saying of Dr. Johnson. I think an acquaintance of his was sentenced to death for forgery or something like that, I don't know, and he was meant to have written some marvellous speech just before he died, and Boswell was querying whether he actually wrote it or not, and Johnson said, when a man knows that he's going to be hanged in the morning, it concentrates his mind wonderfully, and I think that does apply. But the people who need to be convinced of the absolute crisis in emergency are the people in power. It is the politicians, if they've got the political will, if Putin thinks that it is absolutely essential for the survival of Russia as well as the rest of the planet that things should be done, and so on, it gets done. Now, how we manage to persuade the politicians of this is another matter, and people have been talking quite a lot about it, but I think that is, they have got to be convinced that it is necessary for these things to be done, for the things to be done.
Just picking up Sally's point, look, neither of those big examples of what we've done in COVID or the Manhattan Project, neither of those was achieved by the market. It was achieved by public money. We cannot rely on the market as it is currently composed to solve this all for us. So we can just sit back and the capitalists will do it all for us. If we change the rules, the capitalists will do it all for us, but we can't just leave it to the market to sort and get on with our lives.
I like that point. I think we're running out of time, it's 9:30. What I'd quite like to do is ask each of the speakers to just do a final 5 minutes, and David wanted to respond to Simon's point. Will you be happy with that, both of you? Just a short...
I'm not sure what I'm going to say, but... but yeah, well, I can, yeah.
I'm certainly not sure what I would say if I was trying to sum everything up. It's far too complicated. So
who's going...
Did you want to go first? Because you wanted particularly to respond to what Simon said.
Okay, yeah. I think you're right, Simon, that we can't just sit back and let the market... And I don't want you to think that that was what I think. I mean, there are, I do think that when prices come down, I mean, everyone would accept that, you know, if we could get non-fossil fuel energy sources, you know, cheaper than fossil fuels, then the market would actually, you know, would actually kick in. But in order to get there, I do agree that that governments have to actually shape markets. I mean, I'm a great fan of Mariana Mazzucato, who's talking about this as well. She's saying that, you know, a lot of the things that we take for granted, such as mobile phone technology and GPS and all the rest of it, that wasn't all created by the market, private enterprise. You know, governments have to get in and do the innovation. They have to spend hundreds of billions of pounds to get these things to market. So that's what I'm looking for COP26. Yeah, I think I would just. There is common ground between Simon and I, but I still have this feeling that looking to the technology is actually taking it much more seriously than looking to people to do their bit. I'm just, however morally virtuous that might sound, and how that, you know, I'm sure that, you know, if you get on a bike and don't fly and reduce your meat consumption and all the rest of it, all that may be morally virtuous and all the rest of it. But I just don't think that that's really taking the problem seriously. I think the technology is taking it seriously, and the one thing that we can do is to get behind the technology. You know, write to your MP about the technology, about nuclear power, whatever solutions you think need to be put in place. I think that's taking it seriously. I think doing your bit is fine, but that's not really going to cut it. That's my
thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. Finishing off, and Simon. Simon, would you like to say a few final words?
I started my talk by saying that truth seems to be the casualty here, and I'm afraid I think truth is still the casualty. There is great difficulty in actually knowing what works, what the position is. When you drill down into trying to calculate your personal carbon footprint, where you've got to make lots of assumptions before you can work it out. I really liked what Dan had to say, that actually we've just got to trust. We've got to choose who to trust. And I can understand the concerns about the consensus of science may not be perfect, but it's the best we can go for. I think it's I'm afraid David's suggestion that we should write to our MPs just doesn't cut it. Democracy has failed. It's quite clear what John says, that the big business is so influencing politicians that politicians are unable to take the strategic moves, the strategic line that is needed. I'm afraid I'm rather upset by David slightly sneering about doing the good thing, as though that's something, well, you can do the good thing if you want, but it's not really going to cut it. This is a moral issue, because everybody will suffer if we don't all do our bit. No, that's not true. You'll always get freeloaders. You just have to tolerate the freeloaders. But certainly to sneer at... I'm sorry, if you don't like being called sneering.
Well, I'm making an argument. I hope I'm not sneering.
Yes, yeah. Doing the good thing is by definition a good thing. We have a market that is rigged at present. It's quite clear it's rigged because of the influence of big business, and that means that adherence to the free market just isn't working. And you know, there's no case ever that I'm aware of where the free market has helped in a crisis. It certainly didn't help with privatising railways. They didn't suddenly become the perfect means of travel. They were just a means of siphoning our money. No, sorry, socialist point, I'll stop there. But no, in order to get people, to satisfy David that it is worth making a personal sacrifice. I should make out we all need to get behind the science and technology, but we've got to be sceptical, which is a good humanist virtue, as to what it will achieve. Many of these technologies may have reached the working prototype stage, but as far as I can understand with carbon capture, they know how to capture it, but they don't know where to put it. There aren't enough old salt mines to put it down, which are leak-proof. And so that's the problem with men, and ditto with batteries. We need to mine the sea to get lithium or cobalt or whatever, and it's too bloody dangerous and unknown to mine the sea, because the deep ocean, we just don't know what is down there. We have to have a dip in our expectations. We need somebody to lead us, to tell us what that dip must be in a way that is equitable. A carbon tax would seem a bloody good way of helping us, if not rationing. I can see that's going to be extraordinarily difficult to arrange, but it is the best we can do, and we've got the computer technology to arrange carbon taxes or rationing, if that is the way to operate. I agree we don't need to want to be told what to do, but actually, my experience in the forces is that people soldiers anyway, like to be told what to do, and I think, from what I've read in history, people as a whole are quite content to be led. The idea that we can always be free to choose, as T.S. Eliot said, too much choice makes us unhappy. I'm sure Sally can get that quote more accurately. So, I'm not saying that we have to go back to the Stone Age. Personal sacrifice will be necessary, even if we don't stop our trips to Belgrade or wherever for the weekend, because our taxes will have to go up and there will be lots of economic suffering. And that is the reason why sacrifice is absolutely going to be essential for anyone who can't escape it by dodging the system, like the spivs in the Second World War. So, on a very small technical point, it won't be, personal sacrifice won't be essential for everybody, because people will get away with avoiding it. But leaving that exception, everybody should and will have to make personal sacrifices, and that is why, if we're going to have a vote, I'd ask you to vote for the motion.
Okay, that's really difficult. They found all the common ground and they persuaded us that they're both right. And now we're going to have a vote where you have to choose which of those two. I get for or against the motion. The motion was very precisely worded as, I'm afraid, everyone will have to make sacrifices if we're going to meet net zero. So for the record...
Could I just make a point about
no, I'm afraid not now, not at this point, because we're about to finish and we're already way over
It's only
time.
a short point.
Nevertheless.
It relates directly to what Sally said a few minutes ago.
Well, no, we can't keep on going, I'm afraid, because we're about half an hour over what I was supposed to run the timing to. Shows what a good chairman I am, doesn't it? So, please, can you raise your hand if you are in favour of the motion as stated?
I have no idea what that means.
I'm going to do a quick count. 1, 2, 3, 4,
that we should all make sacrifices.
Phil, people are saying they don't know what the motion was.
I'm going to repeat the motion.
Yeah.
Okay. Everyone will have to make sacrifices if we are to meet net zero by 2050.
It's actually personal sacrifice will be required by everyone to ensure that the world achieves carbon net zero by 2050.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on that side, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 out of 28.
That's going to be, whether that's voluntary or involuntary, we're going to be making sacrifices because we're going to be paying more for certain things.
Absolutely,
It's however you interpret it.
I'm afraid that is the wording of the motion.
Shall we check the notes?
It covers different possibilities.
It does say everyone,
It
and
says
so
it.
we're talking everyone who owns
Everyone
big
would-
business as well.
The motion, you're right, we could have worded it better. But the motion was personal sacrifice will have to be made by everyone in order to meet net zero. So we had, I've forgotten what we had.
Yeah, I think
We have a majority, 17 out of 28.
18 including some.
Are we allowed to vote on both sides?
Yes.
17.
Shall we vote for no as well?
The
Because
noes.
some people may be undecided or
Oh yes,
abstain.
okay, can you
On the
please
noes.
raise your hand if you're against the motion? 1, 2, 3, sorry, 5, 6, 7,
David?
9.
David, are you
So
voting against?
So
I'm not
someone's,
allowed apparently.
so I know presidents vote for themselves and everything, but that's not the point here, obviously. Unless you've changed your opinion.
Simon,
Is it
you
worth
vote
asking if
yes?
anyone changed their their vote during the
It is worth
proceedings? Did
asking.
anyone change? Just one. Oh,
No, two.
Yeah. Was that which way? Can we ask which way you changed?
Yes, I was. Everybody would have to make personal sacrifices to.
You changed to my side.
Yes, but
I'll buy you a
just
drink
because
afterwards.
just because
I also
I'm not
changed
sure.
your
I think
side.
everybody's very broad.
No,
I think there will
yeah.
be people that slip through the net.
Okay. And Dan, which way did you?
Same.
I changed my mind. Originally my thought was that not everyone should have to make personal changes, because I think that there are some people who are not in a position to. You know, I've just spent the last over a year on universal credit and I wasn't able to meet my basic living needs a lot of the time, and I couldn't afford to make choices about whether or not to own a car because I can't afford a car. But you know, if there was some way I could help the environment and be able to meet my personal needs, I would have done. And I think people living in slums with only a gas cooker, we can't expect them to switch to solar panels or whatever at their own expense. But I changed my mind that we're all going to have to make sacrifices, because I think that we might have to fund it for them, and that we might take the sacrifice on their behalf. And also, even if they don't, they'll suffer anyway because of the change.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. It's just to support what I was saying about everyone, including big business, because big business is ultimately owned by individuals, maybe wealthy families or wealthy individuals. So on a sort of lighter note, refer people not to a scientific book, but one that was written in the last century by Ben Elton, called Stark.
Yes.
You read it?
Yes.
Where those last 7 wealthy families quietly build themselves a rocket and go off into space. But unfortunately, because they're all very much alpha males, they don't enjoy their time in space. So it's
I'm not in favour of it.
sorry, I've got the ending now.
Give this away. I'm sorry, we have to finish. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted
no, some notices.
Oh yeah, I have got some notes. I also want to do one last thing, which is to offer Simon a hand of friendship and
Yes, indeed. Can I make one notice? For those who feel that the government need a little more persuading, the weekend midway through COP26, the 6th, 7th of November, is a global day of protest. The protest locally will be, the conference at Bournemouth Uni on the Saturday the 6th, and on the 7th there is a vigil at Hurst Castle, because Hurst Castle, you may know it, on the Solent, built by Henry VIII, to keep out some pesky foreigners, is starting, a bit of it fell into the sea last winter.
I know.
a vigil is being held to say, look, government, what are you doing about it? And the more people who come there, the message will be, well, indeed, but the more people are on the streets, the more the government, if they ignore us, we might have to find some other way.
We're leading the way in all sorts of things across the world. We're doing our bit in this country.
Okay, I
And to
think
go and protest.
Let's go to the bar.
Okay.
Yes, please.